Coming up, SpaceX.
SpaceX.
And we'll be talking about SpaceX. Stay tuned. Tomorrow begins now. And welcome to Space Vidcast, episode 7.12 for Saturday, April 26th, 2014. My name is Benjamin Higginbotham. With me, as always, the beautiful, lovely, wonderful, and talented Carrie Ann Higginbotham, and we'll be your hosts for this episode. Did I call it Space Vidcast accidentally?
Yeah.
I did. It's actually, you can see right here, we changed it to tomorrow. It's 7 years of habit. 7 years of habit made that go. We'd like to thank all the premier members of Tomorrow that made this episode happen. These are the people who have contributed at least $10 for this specific episode to make it happen. And we are humbled and honored that you were willing to put money into the show to help make it happen and make it better each and every week. So thank you very much. You can go to patreon.com/TMRO if you'd like to help contribute to the show. Remember, we are community sponsored, so it's your money that helps helps us produce the show. Apparently not well. Apparently this is going to be a bad speaking show. This will be interesting to see how this goes. Let's go ahead and get straight into some space news. First off, last week we talked a little bit about SpaceX and the delays in the flight, and one of the reasons they delayed was something called an MDM. It's a multiplexer demultiplexer on the International Space Station, and this is one of the critical components on the space station. There was a backup, so the backup was running. The astronauts were never in any danger, but it did put SpaceX's launch at risk. Well, they've had some time. They did a spacewalk, and they have actually repaired the failed MDM on Wednesday, April 23rd. Rick help me out with that. Mastracchio and Steve Swanson went out to the International Space Station. And Dad, if you have the clip, it's just voiceover. You can just play it at any time. There you go. So this is actual spacewalk footage of them out there kind of working on it. This was super, super fast. From the door, like from hatch opening to closing, was what, 90 minutes you said?
Yeah, it was an hour and 36 minutes. They left at, I believe it was something like 9:56 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, or 13:56 GMT, and then received. He came back inside 11:32 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, or 15:32 GMT. The other thing of note about this particular spacewalk is that since the incident with the water filling one of the astronauts' spacesuit's helmets, which was in July of last year.
Right, we covered that, yeah.
Yeah, this is, officials have been barred spacewalks for routine maintenance tasks. So it had to be really, really important to go outside, essentially, and do this. Right. Was the only reason that an EVA was allowed.
Actually, this was known as one of the Big 12, I'm air quoting, Big 12 spacewalks that they prepare for on the ground in advance, one of those main big critical spacewalks that they may have to do. So they were prepared, they did it. MDM seems to be back online operational again, so they've got fully fault-tolerant multiplexer demultiplexers.
Yeah, they were saying that there's 46 computers on just the U.S. portion side of the United States, of the space station, and 24 of those are external. Of those 24, this MDM controls 12 of them. So it's a big, big, big deal.
So moving right along, one of the things that happened with the SpaceX launch slipping, so first, I don't remember what happened first or second, but basically the range radar went down, right. And then there was potential weather problems, and then something else slid. A helium leak on the vehicle. So it kept sliding to the right. That happens in space. But because of that, NASA has had to rejigger the COTS transportation schedule to the International Space Station. And that means that now Orbital Sciences, their mission to the International Space Station has slipped to June. It's going to be somewhere around June 10th, and that would come out to around 6:07 a.m. Coordinated Universal Time. And that will be just the same thing as what Dragon did. It's going to be a cargo resupply mission. A little bit different in that it can't take cargo back down.
Right.
So the Antares vehicle can take it can up mass, but it can't down mass.
Right.
So that's one of the big differences
Which
there.
isn't like a huge surprise, really, all in all. And they're not exactly interchangeable, so it's not like one person can take somebody else's slot and all of those other things. But yeah, so they slipped to June, which is a little unfortunate, but it's not to be unexpected.
I was trying to remember the name of the spacecraft. It's the Cygnus spacecraft.
There you
so
go.
Antares launch vehicle, Antares rocket, and Cygnus spacecraft sits on top of that. So June now.
Yay.
Dragon, since last time we talked, Dragon launched to the International Space Station,
Yes.
but now it is birthed to the International Space Station. That is the actual proper term. It has not docked. Docking is when you do it under your own power. Birthing is when you do it under the power of the International Space Station. And because the Dragon uses what's called the big doors, in other words, they have a giant hatch where they can move entire racks through it, not just a small docking collar. So because of that giant hatch, they have to use the berthing ports. And that's exactly what happened. The astronauts on board the International Space Station use Canadarm2. It reaches out to Dragon. It grabs onto it. It pulls it in, and under the space station's power, it will berth and attach Dragon to the International Space Station. And there you can see that's the G&C bay door that's open right there. And there's that kind of triangle-shaped thing. That's what the robotic arm will grab onto. So it grabs onto that, pulls Dragon in, and then the very top part, the round part, is what interfaces with the International
I gotta say,
Space Station.
I love the cargo list are things like there's a fresh spacesuit, habitat for red romaine lettuce to check vegetation growth and microgravity, and legs for Robonaut 2, and legs. So there's a spacesuit, some lettuce, and some legs.
There's more than that.
No, I know, but it's so funny to me for that to be like, all right, check. You got the legs? Yep. All right, check. You got the lettuce? All right. It's just, I don't know.
Well, and
It
remember,
sounds funny.
you were talking about the spacesuit issue.
Yes.
These are the replacement spacesuits to
Yeah.
help fix that issue so that they can go on, I'm going to air quote, casual spacewalks. You don't really do that. And here, actually, you can see the arm coming in to attach to the side of Dragon. So that tool interacts with that and it pulls it in closer.
Very cool.
So there are about 4,600 pounds of supplies, logistics, and experiments aboard the Dragon spacecraft. It stays berthed to the International Space Station for somewhere around a month or so. And then they're going to be reloading it with experiments that they want to bring back and things that need to survive it. Currently, the Dragon is the only spacecraft from any country or any commercial provider that can downmass large quantities of experiments and non-human payload back down to Earth and successfully recover it. All of the other spacecrafts, the Soyuz, it can downmass humans, but not really any experiments. It can only take really small experiments. And then the Progress vehicles, ATV vehicles, all of those, and even the Cygnus, or once it's done upmassing and it's done with its mission, they've offloaded everything, they'll load garbage onto it, but when it comes back down to Earth, those vehicles will break up in the atmosphere, and there, here you can see it getting attached, and yay, capture confirmed. All right, moving along. SpaceX, so Elon had this like last minute surprise press conference in Washington, D.C. Like at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, he was like, hey, just so you know, later today, press conference at an undisclosed location. And it was like, okay. So
a little bit bizarre.
there were three main things. I think they intended it for it to be two. There were three main things that came out of this press conference. One of these things we're going to talk about in the second part of the show. But the other two we're going to talk about right now. And the first one was the reusability. Sounded like it worked really well. Here, in Elon's own words, here you go.
I'm happy to confirm that we were able to do a soft landing of the Falcon 9 boost stage in the Atlantic, all the data that we received back shows that it did the soft landing and was in a healthy condition after that. It does look like it was that the stage was subsequently destroyed by wave action, because the seas were very heavy. It was like 15 to 20 foot seas. So we suspect the stage was destroyed due to the essentially stormy seas. But the data is very clear that it shows a soft landing. It shows deployment of all the legs, and that the stage was in a safe state in the water. With each successive launch, and we have several more launches this year, we expect to get more and more precise with the landing. And if all goes well, I am optimistic that we'll be able to land the stage back at Cape Canaveral by the end of the year.
Dude, by the end of 2014, he's saying they could possibly land the stage back at Cape Canaveral.
That's kind of crazy.
That's
not
insane
gonna lie.
and awesome at the same time. It also sounds like the first stage worked as they expected. It came back down. Part of what we didn't include in that video was he talked a little bit about there was a video downlink that they got from the vehicle that was somewhat dirty. So SpaceX is going to try to clean that up as best they can, and then they may release it on their website for other video geeks to try to clean it up if they can, like basically open source video clean up this thing. Nice. and see what they can get out of it. That's so cool. That was something else that he mentioned at the conference. So huge steps for reusability for a rocket. And actually, I think in the comments, I'll leave it for comments. Someone challenged me on saying this is the first time we've had a rocket with landing legs deployed, and they're like, well, Space Shuttle had landing legs essentially, but we'll talk about that in comments. But this could completely change everything, right? If we can reuse these rockets here on Earth, it could radically reduce the cost of payloads to low Earth orbit, geotransfer orbit, even beyond possibly. It could also help us landing on Mars, and that's, it changes absolutely everything. Also, in this conference, one of the reporters had asked a question about different launch sites, because you get this contention at launch sites. If you've got a vehicle that's stalled for some reason, you're stuck until you can launch that vehicle. Right. And so here was Elon's answer on launch sites.
Well, and our primary launch location is Florida with Cape Canaveral. So we've got Pad 40 on the Cape Canaveral side, and then Pad 39A on the NASA side. And we're actually building out 39A with the ability to do the Falcon Heavy. So probably the first Falcon Heavy launch will be out of the 39A pad, which is really an amazing pad with incredible history. It's where Apollo 11 launched from. So I think that's for the foreseeable future, we expect most of our launch activity to go out of the Cape Canaveral, Cape Kennedy area. We're also developing a launch pad on the south coast of Texas near Brownsville, and we're waiting on the final environmental approvals for that. We expect to get those soon, and we'll probably have that site active in a couple of years. Now, that was the most official statement about Brownsville that I've ever heard from Elon. Yeah. Talking about a potential launch site in southern Texas. Yep. So that would bring the launch sites to Space Launch Complex 4E up in Vandenberg, Space Launch Complex 40, which is where they launch from right now. They just signed the lease for Space Launch Complex 39A, as he mentioned, which is the old Apollo and shuttle launch site. I'm super excited for that. That's going to be awesome. And then, of course, a fourth launch site in right outside, I think he said, Brownsville, Texas. So that would be quite a few launch sites that they'd be able to make sure that they don't have launch contention happening, right, and that they just move whatever resource they need wherever. And awesome. I with the exception of Vandenberg, right? Vandenberg is going to be for polar orbits essentially, right. But you could use 39A and 40 kind of as back and forth sort of thing, and then you could also potentially use Brownsville as just another area, because they're all kind of around the same equilateral. Right. So you could essentially get the same orbit from all three of those launch sites, and that would be
that's good to have options.
Yeah, you have more options for launching the same kind of payloads, and that's only a good thing. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, the main reason that SpaceX had that press conference was not happy news. It was an interesting press conference, and we're going to talk about that when we come back. So stay with us. We'll be right back.
Look into her face, determination in her eyes. She won't give up or quit or fall for little fashion lies. Filled with awesome expectation, this girl's a fascination. Nothing in her way will keep her from her destination, 'cause she's fire walking. When it's hot, she keeps on moving.
No way.
Keeps on improving. Yeah, she's fire walking. She's fire walking to be free.
So I was just telling Carrie Ann, I changed the weekly launch calendar to actually say the word weekly in it. Right. But I wasn't paying attention to the ending frame, and so the last key is like weekly launch calendar. By the time
Good job.
Fix that for next week.
Good job.
Well, before we get started, I wanted to say a huge thank you to all the Space Vidcast patrons who make this go. These are the producers of tomorrow. Again, it's habit for saying Space Vidcast. Producers of tomorrow who help make this episode go. This is everyone who spent $5 or more on this specific episode to bring this to you. And I'd like to say, again, huge thank you. We really absolutely appreciate everything that you do for the show to help make this happen week after week, month after month. And you can get more information on that at patreon.com/TMRO. All right, so the big news that came out of that press conference, I mean, the idea that we're landing the boost stages, that was pretty big news. The Brownsville thing, that was kind of an offhand comment, but still pretty big news. But the big thing is SpaceX is filing suit against the Air Force. Here's Elon's own words.
SpaceX has decided to file suit and protest the Air Force ELV block buy. This is a 36-core sole source uncompeted procurement that was signed earlier this year, and that essentially blocks companies like SpaceX from competing for national security launches. Essentially, what we feel is that that this is not right. That the national security launches should be put up for competition, and they should not be awarded on a sole source, uncompeted basis. And it just seems odd that if our vehicle is good enough for NASA and supporting a $100 billion space station, and it's good enough for launching NASA science satellites, for launching complex commercial geostationary satellites, and really every satellite you can imagine. There's no reasonable basis for it not being capable of launching something quite simple like a GPS satellite.
All right, so fairly fair argument. Now, one thing, tomorrow has a no acronym policy, and EELV is thrown around a lot in all of these. That stands for Evolved Expendable Launch Vehicle, and that's just a fancy way of saying next generation rocket, basically. The EELV program is something that the Air Force has that they, for their basically the rockets that they launch their classified payloads on. So any Air Force classified payload, or I guess even an NRO payload possibly would go up on those as well. Those all go up on what they call EELVs, and that actually is a term that came out of the shuttle era. We used to have rockets, and then the shuttle was reusable, so they renamed the rocket to Expendable Launch Vehicle.
Which I have to say, I think is kind of funny because it's deemed to be expendable. It's deemed to be, well, we're just going to throw this away. That's totally okay. And SpaceX is making this huge push. I mean, it's the name. There's separate. There are separate things, but I just thought that was a funny.
Right.
Anyway.
So what's happened is the Air Force has done a block buy of 36 rocket cores from United Launch Alliance (ULA), and they have spent a fantastic amount of money to do this. And ULA is saying this is what, if you block buy them, this will be cheaper, because if you buy in bulk, the price goes down.
Right. Anyone who's been to Costco knows how that goes.
Yeah, anyone. I mean, that's a fair and reasonable expectation. The problem is that ULA came around when Lockheed Martin and Boeing essentially merged. They didn't merge companies, but they merged into this single entity called ULA that launches both the Atlas V and the Delta IV rocket. And the thought process, the way it was sold to the government was, this will help keep costs lower.
Right.
Unfortunately, what it ended up doing, as in with most monopolies, is it drove the cost up. And now I think they are the most expensive launch provider on the face of the planet. And SpaceX is saying, look, this isn't right. In fact, talking about price, this is what Elon says on how expensive United Launch Alliance is.
The ULA rockets are basically about 4 times more expensive than ours. So this contract is costing the U.S. taxpayers billions of dollars for no reason. And to sort of add salt to the wound, the primary engine used is a Russian main engine made in Russia. And moreover, the person who's sort of heads up Russian space activities is Dmitry Rogozin, who's on the sanctions list. So it seems pretty strange, like, how is it that we're sending hundreds of millions of US taxpayer money at a time when Russia is in the process of invading the Ukraine? And it would be hard to imagine some way that Dmitry Rogozin is not benefiting personally from the dollars that are being sent there. So on the surface of it, it appears that there's good probability of some sanctions violation as well. And we think this deserves to have a spotlight on it. And let's sort of sunshine on this. And as I say, sunlight is the best disinfectant. And if everything's fine, then I guess that's great. But that seems unlikely to me.
So, key thing of pointing out here is that he's talking about Russian engines used in United Launch Alliance vehicles.
Yep.
And that is true for the Atlas V. The Delta IV does not use Russian engines.
Right.
The Atlas V does use the, the RD-188.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, he's not necessarily wrong there, especially when we've got sanctions against Russia right now. We are using these Russian engines, but we also did purchase these a while ago, is my understanding. ULA has said, look, we've got like a 2-year stockpile of these engines.
Right.
So we've got a bunch of these engines. We can kind of wait for the political turmoil to kind of do whatever, work itself out. But they also say that they've got the plans for the engines as well. So, if this doesn't work itself out, they can actually bring production of the engine in-house.
Sure, but bringing production of the engine in-house could take
in-house being in America.
To America could take 2 to 3 years. Theoretically, you could have a year or two gap in the middle there between the time that you've used your stockpile and before you've really spun up production to the point where you can be pumping them out in the rate that you need them to be.
That's potential.
So I think where Elon is having an issue is, look, we're already, yes, it's RD-180s.
I'm sorry, RD-180, yeah.
Yeah, apologize for that. I think what Elon is basically saying is, at least on that front, is that SpaceX is already making them here in America. They're already doing it. They're already doing it at a fairly reliable rate. All of those things are not an issue when you're talking one engine to the other engine. And why sort of risk it to a certain extent? Why be pumping money into, or potentially pumping money into a political war zone isn't the right word. But it is some shaky ground, I suppose, in that. In that aspect. And yes, absolutely, they could bring production to America, pardon me. But again, that if they're not already doing it, if they haven't already started taking those baby steps to make that an actual thing, there could be a block in there, a year or two, which doesn't seem ultimately like a long time, but could really be, that could be 10 launches, that could be 20 launches theoretically.
Of just the Atlas V.
The Atlas V.
Now, the Atlas V is United Launch Alliance's low-cost launcher, right? The Delta IV is their more expensive, heavier launcher.
Right.
Interesting thing, Aerospike mentioned that the American RD-180s expect to be twice as expensive as the Russian ones. Now, I don't have a source for that. I'm just reading from the chat room, but I could totally see that happening, right?
Yeah.
Just ULA doesn't seem to be the most efficient entity on the face of the planet, and I can see the cost.
Sure, but then again, if you're going back from the Air Force's point of view, if you're going back to, hey, ULA has X amount of launches under their belt, SpaceX only has, 9 Falcon 9 launches under their belt, and dates kind of have a tendency to keep moving to the right. Maybe that's an issue, but still, if you look at the first 9 to 10 launches that ULA has under their belt, I don't know what those timelines look like. Maybe they were perfectly right on. And
No, most rockets have issues.
Sure.
Well, ULA. See, it's tricky because you've got ULA being formed after the formation of these rockets.
Right.
So it's not the same.
Sure, but even if you go back to the original time that these, the first 9 launches of the Atlas rocket, what do those look like? What do those timelines look like versus the first 9 of SpaceX's? But ultimately what it comes down to, which I think is kind of Ben's point and Elon's point, is that Elon just wants to be able to compete. This feels like a huge shutout. It's like SpaceX is going to be qualified to compete within months. We're not talking years, months. So by the end of this calendar year, SpaceX will be certified to be able to compete.
In his own words, right here.
There you go.
This is not SpaceX protesting and saying that these launches should be awarded to us. We're just protesting and saying these launches should be competed. And if we compete and lose, that's fine. But why were they not even competed? And it's just that just doesn't make sense. I mean, there's we've heard statements about, well, there's this like certification process. Like, okay, well, we're most of the way through that certification process. So far, there've been 0 changes to the rocket. This is a paperwork exercise, and since this is a large multi-year contract, why not wait a few months for the certification process to complete and then do the competition? That seems very reasonable to me.
Yeah, and I would agree. I think what this is politics at play before SpaceX, right? SpaceX is trying to fight the politics. This is the politics at play. United Launch Alliance knows that they're very expensive and that they haven't done anything to advance the industry. They haven't done anything to drive the cost down. They've just been kind of milking it for all it's worth. And SpaceX, when that happens, you open the door to competition. They did that. Competition has come in, and so they're trying to block that competition so they can continue to milk it for all it's worth. Now that will only work in 2 scenarios. One, for however long they're allowed to block out the competition, which I don't think will last if SpaceX continues to fly reliably and payloads as large as their payloads for massive reduction in cost. Or 2, if there are problems in the commercial sector where you do start having failure after failure after failure, they can point to that and say, hey, look, we have reliability. We cost more, but we're more reliable. They haven't had that opportunity yet,
right?
Because SpaceX has had mission success. Of the 9 flights, I call it 8.5 success. There was only 1 partial failure with a secondary payload, which generally speaking, DoD and Air Force missions wouldn't be considered a secondary payload, so it would be, for them, it would be full mission success. In fact, Senator McCain has gotten involved, and he sent a couple of different letters, basically very sternly worded letters, 2 of them, and here's the beginning of one of them. This one goes to Secretary of the Air Force, Deborah Lee James, and you can kind of see just the introductory paragraph. But then basically it goes on to say, and there's a tiny URL underneath this picture if you want to read the entire text of all of these. Basically it goes on to say, look, I don't think, essentially the fundamental it comes down to, I think you were truthful but lying by leaving out details. And what you actually testified and said wasn't entirely true because of the details that you left out. And I'd like you to explain why this has happened. And so at this point, Senator McCain's involved saying, the hell, guys, what's going on here?
Yeah.
And, when you take a step back and you just look at it, it's essentially, and I hate to oversimplify it to this point, but these launch providers are like FedEx or UPS, right? They're doing the same thing. They're taking a package, a payload, and they're delivering it somewhere. Right. That's all they're doing. And so you don't need the super expensive package delivery service. You just need the one that gets it there on time and reliably. Mm-hmm. And as long as you've got that in the tracking number, right? Well, you should be set. And I think that's kind of Elon's point, is saying, I don't understand how this is happening or why this is happening. This doesn't make any sense. And it's clearly backroom politics. So we'll see how this all plays out. I'm, of course, rooting for SpaceX. Actually, what I'm really rooting for is competition. What I'd really like to see is not just SpaceX, but I'd like to see SpaceX, Orbital, United Launch Alliance, which would be Boeing and Lockheed, and maybe even some other entrants come in and start competing for these launches, because competition is good. Competition forces you to innovate, and it forces you to keep your prices down. It's what keeps the industry on its toes. United Launch Alliance hasn't had competition. Well, they do now. And I'm excited to see what will happen in this new competitive marketplace. I'm not anti-ULA. If ULA can come up and start competing, go ULA, right? Absolutely. If they can start driving their costs down, reduce the cost of access to space, if they can start innovating, doing some sort of flyback program, or maybe there's something that I haven't even dreamed of yet, awesome. Good for them. If they can get humans on Mars cheaply and effectively, great, good for them.
Yeah.
But they need to start innovating in that way. They need to stop being this big, fat, lazy cat sitting on a couch basking in the sunlight of the DoD's money, and get up and start. Was that terrible? That was a bad one. Clearly, I'm done, and we're going to go to a quick break. But that's fundamentally the point of this entire segment. Is it's time to allow competition, and that's SpaceX's point as well. They're not saying they should be awarded these contracts. No. What they're saying is they should be allowed to compete for the contracts. Right now, they're not even allowed to compete, and that's their problem. If they compete and lose, then they lost. That sucks, but then they lost, and ULA still gets to fly. But they need to be allowed to compete. They shouldn't be blocked out of it. All right, we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, comments from last week's show. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
1, 0. Liftoff.
The fleet of space shuttles were doing amazing things in space.
We've got all your space geekery right here.
And welcome back. I'd like to thank all of the Space Vidcast patrons who helped make this episode go. This is anyone who contributed $1 or more. Look at the long list of patrons that we've got at this point, contributing to help make Space Vidcast go. Space Vidcast tomorrow. In all fairness, I am still drugged up. I still do have the plague. How am I supposed to say it?
Plague.
I don't know, it's Minnesotan. I am still fighting a head cold. I am drugged up, so I'll get it right now. It's just 7 years, man. 7 years of saying it. But I do enjoy the new name immensely. Tomorrow. So these are the patrons of Tomorrow who help make this show go. A huge thank you to every single one of them. If you think that there's value in this show, and if you want to help keep this show broadcasting week after week, even $1 helps. Go to patreon.com/TMRO, and please consider contributing. $1 per episode, 50 cents per episode, whatever makes sense for you. For the less than a cup of coffee, you can help keep a show about science, space, and the cosmos on the air and broadcasting worldwide, live and on demand. I think that's pretty cool. And we want to do even bigger, badder, greater things with the show. We continue to invest that money back into the show. We have a new audio board. We did move backwards to our old mics. I'll talk about that after when the show's off the air. And other cool things. So again, patreon.com/TMRO. Let's go ahead and get started with some comments. This first one comes from
Halva Rankus?
There you go.
Yay. Do you two consider yourselves transhumanists? If not, is that partly because you haven't studied sufficiently what transhumanism stands for?
I would say yes. I haven't studied sufficiently.
There were two questions. Were you saying yes to the first one or yes to the second one?
I don't think I understand exactly what a transhuman is. If that's saying someone who believes humanity can be more than what it is today, then yes. But I think that's also evolution. So now whether that's man-made or nature-made, I'm thinking that humans have at this point gotten to the point where they can self-evolve, if that makes any sense. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that fits in that definition. I don't know or understand the definition. It's not an area that I normally study, so I simply don't know.
Although, we're really big fans of Plus Ultra.
Plus Ultra, absolutely.
Next question comes from Fabio Milan, saying, are you forgetting the time elongation when you approach light speed?
Yes. So last week we talked about how... if you're going, you wanted to go somewhere that was 500 light years away, and you're traveling the speed of light. It says even then, it's a 500 year journey.
Right.
And that it was to make a point that I was trying to make the point that these distances are very vast, and even at the theoretical fastest we could go, it would take forever. Unfortunately, that, again, drugged up, as you approach the speed of light, essentially time stops to basically zero. So traveling, while the time on Earth would actually go, your time would stop. So to you, the trip would be essentially instant. To everyone else, when you come back to Earth, everyone you ever knew would be dead. So, unless, of course, we live forever, at which point they would still be there. They'd just be 5,000 years older. So yes, I was completely and totally forgetting about time elongation.
Sure.
Time duration.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, we'll go with that.
Yep, absolutely.
Right?
So yes. But that wasn't the point. The point was vast distances, even with our fastest spacecraft. Not a thing that you're getting to in a single human lifetime. And even then, if I may continue for a moment.
You go right ahead.
You can't travel at the speed of light. The amount of energy required is essentially infinite. So you can't. Okay.
All right. Next comment comes from Bobbert for him. It says, it's okay to say we. When I was a kid, I said we to describe the Apollo project, and that's the way I feel about SpaceX. I'm cheering on every launch, even these little test runs. They have great ambitions, and they're reaching for them. That's my SpaceX, period.
Boom.
Just
Absolutely.
like that.
Just like that. And that comment comes from last week. I was saying we with regards to SpaceX because we do both work at SpaceX. Although the show is completely independent from SpaceX, they have no idea what we're talking about here. We generally try not to talk about SpaceX too much, although this was a SpaceX heavy show. But the views and opinions here on this show have nothing to do with the views and opinions of SpaceX. Just we said that in the beginning in the opening slate. Say that again here. These are our personal opinions and views. Not that of SpaceX.
I agree with Bobbert, though. I do have that particular. That's a verbal tick, if you will, that I've sort of held over myself. I worked at a particular Starbucks. It was my Starbucks. I worked at a particular Target. It was my Target. We as a team, that sort of. That general feeling, though, I do like and I do adhere to, that we as humanity, we as a team, we as a group of humans are doing all of this sort of together. Even if you're doing one thing and I'm doing a different thing, if we all have the same common goal, then we are doing this.
So I would totally agree. And I would say that anyone who's doing the exciting things like this, because my hope is that the journey that SpaceX is going on, sending humans to Mars, that they will bring us along with them. In meaning, much like when we went to the moon, we went to the moon. We were brought along with live video cameras, and I hope that SpaceX does the same thing, but even bigger and grander. Where is this just? I mean, they bring humanity with them in some regards when they go to Mars, and I'm excited for what SpaceX is doing. I think it is collectively our space company, although it's a little bit different because it's not a government space agency, and so we don't have any say in what they do. They're going to do whatever is correct for them, which is both a pro and a con. So yeah, I'm right there with you, Bobbert, for him. It is collectively our space company, and I think a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people are cheering him on, and I'm excited to see what they do next. And you're right, I'll continue referring to them as we because it's probably the right thing to do. I do have to be careful because I don't want people to think that what we say here...
We are not speaking on behalf of we.
That's correct. We are never speaking on behalf of SpaceX. I have to be super clear about that. All right, next one.
Next one comes from Soft Rockification, I hope I'm saying that correctly, saying, I'm sure that both the U.S. and Russian space shuttle had landing legs.
Okay, so that's what I was talking about earlier in the show, the comment. They did not have landing legs, they had landing gear. And the difference is, with the space shuttles, Buran and the space shuttle, which are essentially basically the same thing, they would come down and they had no engine, so they'd bleed off energy, and then they'd land on a perfectly smooth and straight runway, and then they'd send out some chutes, and that runway had to be there in order for them to land. Here's the key difference. With landing legs, we don't need a runway.
Right.
So let's just say, for instance, you're going to, I don't know, let's just pick a random place, Mars.
Okay. Super random.
Random place.
Totes.
Never been to Mars before. There's no runway. So now my landing gear, no worky. But landing legs, as long as the surface is flat enough, right? And even flattish, and even then they can probably compensate a little bit. Flattish. They can land on that surface. And that is the key difference here, is they don't need a preset landing area. At least we don't think. They haven't successfully recovered a stage yet. So
well, and the other thing to think about is the differentiation between landing gear and landing legs is the mobility. Landing legs are, once they come out, they are stiff, they have pads, they come down, they touch down, that's it. Landing gear, they come out, they have wheels, and they continue to move. Landing legs don't do such things. I mean, it's oversimplification, but kind of like Ben was saying, that there's no runway needed. There isn't a landing pad even needed. That it's just flat-ish or so. You can come down and you stop. You don't come down and kind of wiggle around a little bit or roll around or anything along those lines.
Dilation, that was the word I was trying to remember earlier.
Nice.
Time dilation.
Time dilation. It's in there somewhere.
There's an irony that I took that long for me to remember time dilation.
Just getting there. One last comment comes from Time Like a One, saying that, well, thank you for Benjamin for highlighting that. Now I can't.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I appreciate that. I'll keep bashing government because government is filled to the brim with people who know nothing about how to solve technical problems. And in a technological world, we need more people who can solve technical problems.
Okay. True-ish, but I will argue, especially if you're in the United States, that you elect those officials. And so if you're electing people who don't understand how to solve technical problems, and that's the thing you believe they need to be able to do, then shame on you. And if you're like, well, I didn't vote for them, then a majority of people disagree with you. And that's how the government in the U.S. essentially works. I oversimplified that, but you get the idea. And many people can argue, and please do in a civilized way in the comments. In a civilized way, please feel free to disagree. But do we need senators who understand technology? I'm not sure that that's correct. They need to understand the implications of technology.
Yes.
And how it weaves with society. But they don't need to understand the technology itself. They don't need to understand how TCP/IP works.
Right.
They just need to understand that the internet is a utility that everyone should have access to.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. There's always the saying of a great leader knows how to delegate.
Yeah, sure.
Right.
Yeah.
That the head person, the leader, doesn't do all of the things, but they know how to delegate. They know who best to assign to those things. They know, when they need to delegate, all of those sorts of ideas. And I that's how I sort of view the United States governmental system. So Ben then at that point is right, because if you feel as though the people who are in the power are not the right ones there, then
remove them.
Yeah,
get rid of them. Don't let them be in power anymore.
That's how
the system works. Again, made that sound a little simpler than it is, but you get the idea. And actually, as Chris Radcliffe brought up in the live chat room, we do have a subreddit now at reddit.com/r/TMRO, and that's a great place to have civilized debates. And then the good comments flow up to the top, the bad ones flow down to the bottom. And I highly encourage you to check it out. Post stuff that is related to potential future stories, things that you are interested in. Maybe it's space related, maybe it's just how we get on Mars, maybe it's not space related, but something about tomorrow. Maybe it's about how if you split an atom in half and it wiggles. And
maybe it's transhumanist related.
Sure, whatever. I mean, it's a great place for you to comment on things that are interesting and will help push humanity forward and move the human race to tomorrow, as it were. All right, I'd like to thank everyone so much for watching this week. Again, patreon.com/TMRO helps keep the show going week after week. Hopefully we fixed the audio issues a little bit. We brought back the old microphone. We'll talk about what happened in post-show. For those of you who are watching live, stay tuned. After Dark is up next. If you are not watching live and on demand, remember, we do the show live every Saturday at 2100 Coordinated Universal Time. We'd love to see you here. It's great to have these guys in the chat room, and you get to hang out with us after the show. So thank you guys so much for watching. We'll see you next week.
surprise, really, all in all. And they're not exactly interchangeable, so it's not like one person can take somebody else's slot and all of those other things. But yeah, so they slipped to June, which is a little unfortunate, but it's not to be unexpected.
I was trying to remember the name of the spacecraft. It's the Cygnus spacecraft.
There you
so
go.
Antares launch vehicle, Antares rocket, and Cygnus spacecraft sits on top of that. So June now.
Yay.
Dragon, since last time we talked, Dragon launched to the International Space Station,
Yes.
but now it is birthed to the International Space Station. That is the actual proper term. It has not docked. Docking is when you do it under your own power. Birthing is when you do it under the power of the International Space Station. And because the Dragon uses what's called the big doors, in other words, they have a giant hatch where they can move entire racks through it, not just a small docking collar. So because of that giant hatch, they have to use the berthing ports. And that's exactly what happened. The astronauts on board the International Space Station use Canadarm2. It reaches out to Dragon. It grabs onto it. It pulls it in, and under the space station's power, it will berth and attach Dragon to the International Space Station. And there you can see that's the GNC bay door that's open right there. And there's that kind of triangle-shaped thing. That's what the robotic arm will grab onto. So it grabs onto that, pulls Dragon in, and then the very top part, the round part, is what interfaces with the International
I gotta say,
Space Station.
I love the cargo list are things like there's a fresh spacesuit, habitat for red romaine lettuce to check vegetation growth and microgravity, and legs for Robonaut 2, and legs. So there's a spacesuit, some lettuce, and some legs.
There's like more than that.
No, I know, but it's so funny to me to.
Coming up, SpaceX.
SpaceX?
And we'll be talking about SpaceX. Stay tuned. Tomorrow begins now.
Private space station.
And welcome to Space Vidcast, episode 7.12 for Saturday, April 26th, 2014. My name is Benjamin Higginbotham. With me, as always, the beautiful, lovely, wonderful, and talented Carrie Ann Higginbotham, and we'll be your hosts for this epic. So did I call it Space Vidcast accidentally?
Yeah.
I did. It's actually, you can see right here, we
It's
changed
okay.
it to tomorrow. It's 7 years of habit. 7 years of habit made that go. We'd like to thank all the premier members of Tomorrow that made this episode happen. These are the people who have contributed at least $10 for this specific episode to make it happen. And we are humbled and honored that you were willing to put money into the show to help make it happen and make it better each and every week. So thank you very much. You can go to patreon.com/TMRO if you'd like to help contribute to the show. Remember, we are community sponsored, so it's your money that helps helps us produce the show.
Important to go outside, essentially, and do this
Right.
was the only reason that an EVA was allowed.
Actually, this was known as one of the Big 12, I'm air quoting,
Yeah.
Big 12 spacewalks that they prepare for on the ground in advance, one of those main big critical spacewalks that they may have to do. So they were prepared, they did it. MDM seems to be back online operational again, so they've got fully fault-tolerant multiplexer demultiplexers.
Yeah, they were saying that there's 46 computers on just the U.S. portion side of the United States, of the space station, and 24 of those are external. Of those 24, this MDM controls 12 of them. So it's a big, big, big deal.
So moving right along, one of the things that happened with the SpaceX launch slipping, so first, I don't remember what happened first or second, but basically the range radar went down,
Right.
and then there was potential weather problems, and then something else slid. A helium leak on the
right,
vehicle.
the helium
So it
leak.
kept sliding to the right. That happens in space. But because of that, NASA has had to rejigger the COTS transportation schedule to the International Space Station. That means that now Orbital Sciences, their mission to the International Space Station has slipped to June. It's going to be somewhere around June 10th, and that would come out to around 6:07 a.m. Coordinated Universal Time. And that will be just the same thing as what Dragon did. It's going to be a cargo resupply mission. A little bit different in that it can't take cargo back down.
Right.
So the Antares vehicle can take up, it can up mass, but it can't down mass.
Right.
So that's one of the big differences
Which
there.
isn't like a huge, for that to be like, all right, check. You got the legs? Yep. All right, check. You got the legs? All right. You know, it's just, I don't know.
Well, and remember,
sounds funny.
you were talking about the spacesuit issue.
Yes.
These are the replacement spacesuits to help fix that issue so that they can go on, I'm going to air quote, casual spacewalks. You don't really do that. And here, actually, you can see the arm coming in to attach to the side of Dragon. And, you know, so that tool interacts with that and it pulls it in closer. So there are about 4,600 pounds of supplies, logistics, and experiments aboard the Dragon spacecraft. It stays berthed to the International Space Station for somewhere around a month or so. And then they're going to be reloading it with stuff experiments that they want to bring back and things that need to survive it. Currently, the Dragon is the only spacecraft from any country or any commercial provider that can downmass large quantities of experiments and non-human payload back down to Earth and successfully recover it. All of the other spacecrafts, the Soyuz, it can downmass humans, but not really any experiments. It can only take really small experiments. And then the Progress vehicles, ATV vehicles, all of those, and even the Cygnus, well, once it's done upmassing and it's done with its mission, they've offloaded everything, they'll load garbage onto it, but when it comes back down to Earth, those vehicles will break up in the atmosphere, and there, here you can see it getting attached, and yay, capture confirmed. All right, moving along. SpaceX, so Elon had this like last minute surprise press conference in Washington, D.C. Like at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. He was like, hey, just see, apparently not well. Apparently this is going to be a bad speaking show. This will be interesting to see how this goes. Let's go ahead and get straight into some space news. First off, last week we talked a little bit about SpaceX and the delays in the flight, and one of the reasons they delayed was something called an MDM. It's a multiplexer demultiplexer on the International Space Station, and this is one of the critical components on the space station. There was a backup, so the backup was running. The astronauts were never in any danger, but it did put SpaceX's launch at risk. Well, they've had some time. They did a spacewalk, and they have actually repaired the failed MDM on Wednesday, April 23rd. Rick help me out with that. Mastracchio and Steve Swanson went out to the International Space Station. And Dad, if you have the clip, you can it's just voiceover. You can just play it at any time. There you go. So this is actual spacewalk footage of them out there kind of working on it. This was super, super fast. From the door, like from hatch opening to closing was, what, 90 minutes you said?
Yeah, it was an hour and 36 minutes. They left at, I believe it was something like 9:56 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, or 13:56 GMT, and then he came back inside 11:32 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, or 15:32 GMT. The other thing of note about this particular spacewalk is that since the incident with the water filling one of the astronauts' spacesuit's helmets, which was in July of last year.
Right, we covered that, yeah.
Yeah, this is, officials have been barred spacewalks for routine maintenance tasks. So it had to be really, really important